So what is the potential and the impact of carbon capture, removal, and storage with respect to climate change and environmental pollution? Obviously, it's an interesting and promising technology in our fight against climate change and environmental pollution, because we can either prevent further CO2 emission from reaching the atmosphere by capturing it directly after where it occurs, or removing excess CO2 from the environment. And it also integrates nicely with the existing industrial infrastructure, because you can just add it on demand where emissions occur or are created, and then utilize the captured CO2 emission in some way or just store it safely. And it also buys us more time. No matter whether you see CO2 capture, removal, and storage as some kind of long-term solution or not, it definitely buys us some time, because all the CO2 that does not reach the atmosphere helps us. So the less CO2 reaches the atmosphere, the better. But it also has its downsides. And that is nicely illustrated by the impact or the potential that carbon capture, removal, and storage has. And to just put that a little bit in perspective, we have here the numbers that illustrate how much CO2 we can emit if we want to keep the 2-degree global warming goal with this 50-50% chance. That gives us roughly 1,350 gigatons of CO2 that we can still emit. And please keep in mind that only gives us a 50% chance, which is not really a lot, because none of you would probably enter an airplane if there is a 50% chance of dying or the airplane crashes. But it's one of those common numbers that you use for providing at least some kind of quantification how much CO2 we can still emit. So how much CO2 could carbon capture, removal, and storage save us per year? And if we look at these numbers provided by the IPCC report, you will notice that this is not really that much. So we're talking about roughly half a gigaton per year in the context of the fossil fuel industry. And if you then look in comparison to what renewable energies like solar or wind power could do, we're talking about much more. So something like 4 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year that we could make up for. So this 500,000 is definitely something, because otherwise it would just go to the atmosphere and we would have to figure out how to make up for it. But it's not as much as you might think, given the advertisements and marketing of large companies that try to justify their environmentally dangerous and harmful behavior by just saying, look, all of this is not really a problem because we do carbon capture and storage, so you can still safely consume our services. And this pretty much leads us to yet another disadvantage of carbon capture and storage. So first, the potential is not as big as it might seem. And the other big disadvantage is that it gives you a false sense of safety, because it fosters our continuous dependency on fossil fuels, like this being the main thing, because it doesn't really incentivize us to move towards renewable energies or to consider electrification and decarbonization, as we'll cover in the next video. It just tells us as long as we carbon capture and store and remove, everything will be fine. And this is just not the case, because it is a process that requires energy, it requires resources, and it also is quite expensive, as you can see here, because the costs of removing CO2 are, let's say, still expensive. It's really difficult to put an exact number on it, because it depends on where you capture it, where you store it, how do you transport it there, or if you are considered with removing carbon emissions from the atmosphere after they already occurred. So just as an example, direct carbon capture and storage from the air is something that costs us between 130 and 350 US dollars per metric ton. So quite a lot, especially given that we're causing quite a lot of emissions per year. So this is per ton. In the previous figures and numbers, we're talking about gigatons. So there is quite a lot of money involved, so it's not really a cheap alternative to not emitting something in the first place. So what's the take-home message here? Carbon capture, removal, and storage exists. It can help us to prevent further carbon emission into the atmosphere. It can also help us to extract already caused emissions again from the atmosphere. But it is something that is still not widely available and slightly experimental. It is expensive and costs money, it costs energy, it costs resources. And it is also something that has a limited potential, just due to the previous factors that we mentioned. And finally, as always, we're coming back to the fact that it is way more sustainable to not cause any damage by consuming anything in the first place than trying to clean up after you already caused the mess. So not emitting CO2 in the first place is way more sustainable than trying to capture, remove, and or store or utilize it later on.